The first rays of June 4th, 1942 pierced through the Pacific darkness as Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier. Akagi, unaware that his massive fleet sailed toward the most devastating trap in naval history, 400 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy cut through the swells for aircraft carriers. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers all moving in perfect formation toward what they believed would be another easy victory. The morning air carried the salt spray and diesel fumes as flight deck crews prepared the first wave of bombers. Nagumo's confidence was absolute. American naval power in the Pacific had been crippled at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, and every subsequent engagement had gone Japan's way. The attack on Midway would eliminate the last American stronghold in the Central Pacific, opening the path to Hawaii and forcing the United States to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. What Nagumo could not know was that every radio transmission from his fleet had been intercepted and decoded by American cryptographers. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had cracked the Japanese naval code J-125, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew not only the exact composition of the attacking force, but also its precise timing and approach vector. The Americans had turned the element of surprise, Japan's greatest weapon, against itself. As the sun climbed higher, the first wave of 108 Japanese aircraft lifted off from the carriers Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu. The planes formed up in perfect V formations, their rising sun emblems gleaming in the morning light as they headed toward Midway. Below them, the massive fleet continued its steady advance, maintaining radio silence that was now meaningless on Midway itself. Radar operators had detected the incoming strike at a range of 93 miles. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marine fighters scrambled to meet the attackers. The obsolescent Brewster Buffalo fighters and handful of Wildcats rose to challenge the veteran Japanese pilots, knowing they faced overwhelming odds but determined to buy time for the real battle that was about to unfold. The Japanese bombers struck Midway at 6:30 in the morning, their ordnance cratering runways and igniting fuel stores. Black smoke billowed skyward as hangars collapsed and buildings disintegrated under the precise bombardment. From his flagship, Nagumo watched the smoke columns rising on the horizon and nodded with satisfaction. The first phase was proceeding, exactly as planned. But 155 miles to the northeast, 3 American aircraft carriers lay in wait. Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise and Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown had positioned their task forces perfectly, using intelligence reports to anticipate every Japanese move. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and now the hunters would become the hunted. The greatest naval battle of the Pacific War was about to begin. The fate of nations hung in the balance as American dive bombers prepared for their historic strike. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice crackled over the radio from his damaged bomber as he completed his assessment of Midway's defenses at 7 o'clock that morning. "There is need for a second attack," he transmitted to the Akagi. The words that would seal the fate of the Japanese fleet. Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his naval career, unaware that American dive bombers were already climbing toward his position from 3 different directions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight decks of the Japanese carriers as Nagumo weighed his options. Second-wave aircraft sat armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to engage any American naval forces that might appear. But Tomonaga's report suggested that Midway's airfield remained operational, requiring another strike to suppress the base completely. The Admiral's fatal indecision began as he ordered the rearming of his strike. Aircraft with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets, organized chaos erupted.
Ice.
Below decks, as Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching weapons loads, torpedoes were hoisted from bomb bays and replaced with general-purpose bombs, while mechanics recalibrated fusing mechanisms. The process would take at least an hour that would determine the outcome of the war in the Pacific. Aviation gasoline lines snaked across the steel decks, creating a volatile cocktail waiting for ignition. At 7:28, a Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the American fleet. radioing the electrifying message, "Enemy fleet sighted." The pilot's subsequent clarification. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. Nagumo immediately countermanded his rearming order, demanding that the torpedo bombers be reconfigured once again for naval targets. The double rearming created pandemonium on the carrier decks. Mountains of bombs and torpedoes cluttered the hangars and flight decks. Sweating ordnance crews struggled to complete the weapon changes. Fuel lines remained connected to aircraft, and bomb racks lay scattered across the deck spaces. The precision and efficiency that characterized Japanese naval operations had devolved into desperate improvisation. Meanwhile, 110 miles away, the American strike force had found its target. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, had followed a lone Japanese destroyer back to the main fleet after initially missing his intercept point. His radio call, "Enemy carriers in sight," marked the beginning of the most decisive 10 minutes in naval aviation history. The Japanese carriers maneuvered frantically to avoid the incoming American attack, their defensive formations dissolving. As each ship turned independently to launch aircraft and evade bombs, combat air patrol fighters climbed desperately toward the American dive bombers. But most had been drawn down to sea level by earlier torpedo attacks and could not regain altitude in time. The morning that had begun with such promise for Japanese arms was about to become their darkest hour, as McCluskey's bombers pushed over into their attack dives. The rising sun battle flag snapped in the Pacific wind above 4 aircraft carriers packed with fuel, ordnance, and hope. The next few minutes would witness the destruction of Japan's maritime dominance and mark the turning point of the Pacific War. The sound of diving aircraft engines grew louder as Destiny approached at terminal velocity. At 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive toward the aircraft carrier Kaga, beginning the most devastating attack in naval aviation history. 36 more American dive bombers followed him down through the scattered clouds, their engines screaming as they plunged toward the Japanese fleet at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. The scene below resembled a perfectly orchestrated disaster waiting to unfold. The 4 Japanese carriers had been caught in their most vulnerable moment, flight decks crammed with fully fueled and armed aircraft. Fuel lines snaking everywhere and ordnance stacked in deadly piles. The double rearming had turned each carrier into a floating ammunition depot. And now American bombs were falling with deadly precision toward these floating volcanoes. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College Review, the first bomb struck the Kaga at exactly 10:24, penetrating the flight deck near the island's superstructure and detonating among parked aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction as aviation fuel ignited, sending sheets of flame racing across the wooden flight deck. Within seconds, the carrier's forward elevator shaft became a chimney, drawing the inferno down into the hangar spaces below, where more aircraft waited like kindling. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Best's section from the Enterprise attacked the flagship. Akagi, his 1,000-pound bomb, crashed through the flight deck just behind the amidships elevator, the explosion lifting parked aircraft into the air like toys and igniting the fuel-soaked deck planking. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, watched in horror as his flagship transformed from Japan's premier warship into a blazing pyre in less than 60 seconds. The Soryu received the same treatment from dive bombers. Launched from the Yorktown, 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the carrier's flight deck into an inferno, while secondary explosions from stored torpedoes and bombs tore massive holes in her hull. The carrier's damage control teams, trained to fight fires and flooding, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of destruction raining down from the American aircraft. Black smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the Pacific sky, visible for 50 miles in every direction. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel, rubber, and wood mixed with the screams of trapped sailors and the continuous roar of secondary explosions. What had been the most powerful carrier strike force in the world minutes earlier was now 3 floating funeral pyres, their crews fighting desperately to save what could be saved. The Hiryu, separated from the main formation, escaped the initial American attack and immediately began launching her own strike force toward the American carriers. Her aircraft, led by experienced pilots who had fought from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, climbed toward the enemy task force with revenge burning in their hearts. The battle was far from over, but the strategic initiative had shifted decisively. To the Americans, as the morning sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, the sound of exploding ammunition and collapsing aircraft filled the air around the burning Japanese carriers. Destroyers moved in close to rescue survivors, their crews watching in awe and horror as the pride of the Imperial Navy died in agony. The 10 minutes that changed the course of World War II had come and gone, leaving 3 aircraft carriers as smoking testimony to the power of intelligence, timing, and precision bombing. While 3 Japanese carriers burned out of control, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained untouched and deadly dangerous, immediately launching a counterstrike that would test American resolve and damage control capabilities. Captain Tomio Kaku ordered every available aircraft into the air at 11 o'clock that morning, sending 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, racing toward the American task force under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, the Hiryus. Strike Force climbed steadily through the Pacific sky, their pilots seasoned veterans of campaigns stretching from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. These men had never known defeat, and the sight of their sister ships burning behind them only intensified their determination to extract revenge from the American fleet. The rising sun emblems on their wings caught the sunlight as they formed up for what would become the most determined Japanese attack of the battle. Aboard the American carriers, radar operators tracked the incoming Japanese strike, while fighter directors scrambled to position Wildcat interceptors. The Enterprise and Hornet began launching additional fighters while the Yorktown, closest to the approaching enemy formation, prepared to receive the full weight of Japanese fury. Her flight deck crews worked frantically to spot Aircraft 4, launch while damage control parties stood ready for the inevitable assault. At 12:10 in the afternoon, the Japanese dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs against the Yorktown. The American carrier twisted and turned at maximum speed, her anti-aircraft batteries filling the sky with deadly black puffs of flak. But the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. The first bomb struck near the island superstructure, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals before exploding with devastating effect. 2 more bombs followed in rapid succession, each explosion sending shockwaves throughout the carrier's hull and igniting fires in multiple compartments. The Yorktown's speed dropped to 6 knots as her engineering spaces filled with smoke and her flight operations ground to a halt. Dead and wounded sailors were carried topside as damage control teams fought to save their ship from the same fate that had befallen the Japanese carriers. But American damage control proved far superior to Japanese efforts. Within hours, the Yorktown's crew had restored power, suppressed the fires, and patched the flight deck sufficiently to resume limited operations. The carrier that Japanese pilots reported as sinking would soon surprise them by launching aircraft against their remaining ship. This resilience, born of superior damage control, training, and equipment, would prove crucial in the battle's final phase. The Hiryu launched a second strike in the afternoon. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters, under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had recommended the second attack on Midway that morning. Flying his damaged aircraft with extraordinary skill, Tominaga led his formation through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver a torpedo attack that would further damage the Yorktown and slow her retreat, as the afternoon sun began its descent. Toward the western horizon, the score stood at 3 Japanese carriers destroyed and 1 American carrier severely damaged. The Hiryu remained operational and dangerous, her crew determined to continue the fight despite overwhelming odds. But unknown to Captain Kaku and his sailors, American search planes had already located his position, and a final strike force was climbing toward the last operational Japanese carrier. The day's decisive battle was entering its climactic phase, with the fate of the Pacific War hanging in the balance as dive bombers once again prepared to determine the outcome of nations through precision and courage. As the Pacific sun tracked toward evening on June 4th, 1942, The aircraft carrier Hiryu stood alone against the combined might of two American task forces. Her crew determined to fight until the last aircraft was launched and the final bomb expended. Captain Tomio Kaku paced his bridge, knowing that his ship represented Japan's last hope of salvaging something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. At 2:45 in the afternoon, scout planes from the Enterprise finally located the elusive Hiryu, reporting her position as steaming northwest at high speed with a screen of destroyers and cruisers. Admiral Raymond Spruance immediately ordered a maximum effort strike. Knowing that this fourth Japanese carrier could still inflict serious damage on his forces if allowed to escape, 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, supported by fighters from the Hornet, climbed into the afternoon sky for what would be the battle's final carrier engagement. The Hiryu's radar detected the incoming American formation at a range of 40 miles, giving her crew precious minutes to prepare. For the assault, combat air patrol fighters climbed desperately to intercept while anti-aircraft batteries trained skyward. Their crews, knowing that this attack would determine whether their ship lived or died, Okaria turned into the wind and increased speed to maximum revolutions, her wake carving a white path across the dark Pacific waters. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led the Enterprise dive bombers into their attack at 5 o'clock, his aircraft screaming down through moderate anti-aircraft fire toward the frantically maneuvering Japanese carrier. The Hiryu twisted and turned with remarkable agility, her helmsman executing radical course changes that threw off several bombing runs. For a few moments, it appeared that Japan's last carrier might escape the fate of her sisters. But American bombing accuracy had improved throughout the day, and the fourth attack proved devastating. 4 direct hits struck the Hiryu in rapid succession, the 1,000-pound bombs penetrating her flight deck and exploding in her hangar spaces with catastrophic results. Aviation fuel ignited immediately, sending flames racing through the ship's vitals while secondary explosions tore apart aircraft and equipment. The Hiryu's damage control efforts proved futile against the intensity of the fires. Unlike the American Yorktown, whose crew had successfully suppressed similar damage, the Japanese carrier lacked sufficient equipment and training to contain the conflagration. Within an hour, flames had spread throughout the ship, making further operations impossible and forcing the crew to fight for their lives rather than their vessel. As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lay dead in the water, their fires visible for miles across the ocean. The mobile force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been reduced to burning hulks in a single day. Taking with them hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and the strategic initiative in the Pacific War, Captain Kaku made the agonizing decision to abandon ship at 2 in the morning on June 5th, ordering his surviving crew members into the water before choosing to go down with his vessel. The Hiryu, last of Japan's great carriers to fall at Midway, slipped beneath the Pacific waves at 5:10 that morning, carrying with her the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship 300 miles away, received the final reports with growing disbelief and rage. His carefully planned operation to destroy American naval power had instead resulted in the loss of Japan's 4 finest aircraft carriers and their irreplaceable air groups. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun with the sinking of the last Japanese carrier in the pre-dawn darkness. The morning of June 5, 1942, dawned gray and somber over the Pacific battlefield, revealing the full scope of destruction that 24 hours of combat had wrought upon both fleets. Oil slicks stretched for miles across the ocean surface, marking the graves of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, while debris fields told the story of individual tragedies played out on an oceanic scale. Aboard the American carriers, exhausted flight crews counted the cost of their victory. While preparing for possible Japanese retaliation, the Enterprise and Hornet remained fully operational, their flight decks busy with search patrols and combat air patrol operations. But the damaged Yorktown limped eastward with her escort of destroyers, her crew working around the clock to keep their wounded ship afloat. The human toll of the battle became apparent as rescue operations continued throughout the morning. American destroyers pulled Japanese survivors from life rafts and debris, finding men who had served aboard ships that no longer existed. Many of these sailors had been present at Pearl Harbor, their stories of that attack now footnotes to their own survival in the Central Pacific. The warriors who had seemed invincible 6 months earlier now clung to wreckage. Their empire's expansion halted forever. Japanese losses staggered the imagination of military planners on both sides. 3,500 sailors and aviators had perished with their ships, including some of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots who could never be replaced. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had taken to the bottom not only their crews, but also the institutional knowledge and combat experience that had made Japanese naval aviation supreme throughout the early war period. According to the comprehensive analysis published in the Pacific Historical Review, the material losses extended far beyond the carriers themselves. Over 250 aircraft had been destroyed, along with their trained pilots, mechanics, and support personnel. The Japanese had also lost one heavy cruiser, the Makuma, sunk by dive bombers on June 6th, while several other vessels suffered significant damage during the extended battle. But the American victory came at a substantial price as well. The Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, finally succumbed to torpedo attacks from the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 7th. The carrier that had survived the Battle of Coral Sea and the initial Japanese strikes at Midway could not overcome the combination of bomb and torpedo damage, taking 141 American sailors to their deaths as she rolled over and sank. The strategic implications of Midway's outcome would reshape the entire Pacific War. Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations had been crippled, forcing the empire onto the defensive for the remainder of the conflict. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their air groups meant that Japanese naval aviation would never again achieve the concentration of force that had characterized the early war period. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, understood immediately that the tide had turned. American industrial capacity would now have time to produce the ships, aircraft, and trained personnel necessary to carry the war to Japan's home islands. The defensive phase of American operations in the Pacific was ending, replaced by the long, offensive campaign that would culminate 3 years later in Tokyo Bay. As the sun set on June 5th, search planes continued, sweeping the empty ocean where the mobile force had died, finding only scattered debris and oil slicks to mark the passing of Japan's naval supremacy. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would echo across the Pacific for years to come. The Battle of Midway concluded on June 7th, 1942, but its reverberations would shape the remainder of World War II and establish principles of naval warfare that persist to this day. In the space of 4 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost its strategic initiative in the Pacific. While American forces demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, received the final battle reports aboard his flagship Yamato with visible anguish. The man who had warned Japan's leaders that they had awakened a sleeping giant now witnessed the full consequences of his prophetic words. His carefully planned decisive battle had indeed occurred, but victory belonged to the Americans rather than the empire he served. The immediate aftermath of Midway saw both sides reassessing their strategies and capabilities. Japan, deprived of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups, shifted to a defensive posture designed to hold existing conquests rather than expand the empire further. Construction of new carriers accelerated, but the trained pilots lost at Midway could not be replaced quickly enough to maintain Japan's qualitative advantage in naval aviation. American confidence soared as news of the victory spread throughout the Pacific Fleet and back to the United States. The nation that had endured 6 months of defeats and disasters finally had proof that Japanese forces could be beaten decisively when met with superior intelligence and tactical execution. Morale improvements extended from individual sailors to the highest levels of government, where strategic planning shifted from defensive operations